Now that we've gotten the geeky part out of the way, hi everyone, I'm Ioana Gonçalves and I'm leading the data engineering team for BorgWarner. For who didn't hear about BorgWarner before, we are an S&P 500 company, 14 billion revenue. We're a tier 1 auto supplier and we're headquartered in Auburn Hills. I'm here today to walk you through how we've built our first centralized data lake with a team of 3 people. So this is not going to be a best practices talk. It's not a cautionary tale either. It's a sequence of short stories from how we've built our first centralized data lake in a large enterprise. So each one of them is about a decision we made that felt reasonable at the time, the thing that broke afterward, and what we changed next. Each section ends with a takeaway, not necessarily because I love frameworks, but because listening to someone talk for 30 minutes without knowing why is a lot to ask. Diving into our current architectural model that you're going to see behind me, we have a lot more fancier data source systems into it than how we started. So how we're actually doing all of this layering today is that we have a plethora of data sources. We extract the data with Azure Data Factory. For now, we also have Azure DevOps on top of it, which we didn't start with. We would ingest the data then into Snowflake. I'm trying to not sound. We would then ingest the data into Snowflake, which has a medallion-centered architecture. We work with dbt today for data modeling, and after that, we consume the data into Power BI. Well, not we, but the end users, hopefully. However, we didn't start like so. We just wanted to extract data out of SAP ECC, some flat files, some SharePoint files. Everything was batch. We had no real live ambitions for live data, no streaming data. We had some scheduled jobs and hope in the fact of in the face of the fact that we were doing this with 3 people. There was also no standard definition of ownership, no agreed upon standard of work, and no operating model. Everybody wanted data, but mostly in the abstract sense of wanting it to exist somewhere else, and especially not in that SAP layer because it was painful to work with. So early on, we intentionally avoided deep governance conversations because we wanted to focus on one very basic question. Can we reliably move data into one place without creating new problems in the process? Not because governance wasn't important, but because it was purely hypothetical at that point. I'm just going to try to move maybe on that side because it's annoying me. Okay. So we just wanted to understand how we were able to move said data and ignore the governance in the process. And once we started having reliable data flow, people stopped arguing about principles. They started arguing about tables, access rights, refresh times, which was progress in our case. It turns out it's much easier to argue about governance when you actually have something to govern. Before that, it's mostly strong opinions and very confident PowerPoint slides. So as I promised in my opening, I would leave you with a takeaway from each one of these sections. And the major takeaway I have from this process is that data, if you do not have yet reliable data movement early on, talking about governance can slow you down and it will feel very abstract. I found that early speed can drive better governance later, as long as you are honest that some of those early decisions are temporary and you do not make them part of your long-term operating model. But how did we actually lock in our ingestion process? And when we look at ADF, how did that actually look like? So this is us zooming in on this ingestion pattern. every time we wanted to extract data out of a source system, we had the same conversations. Should we optimize volumes early? Should we normalize the data? Do we want to filter out columns? How much transformation do we want to do early on? So instead of focusing on this, we took the decision to focus on how does actually ADF work with our data sources. Once we understood that, we logged in a very boring ingestion recipe and we stopped negotiating it. So to that point, every time we'd onboard a new data source, we followed the pattern. We had Azure Data Factory connectors in collaboration with technical users. We would extract one-to-one from the source. We wouldn't transform anything at that point. We would stage the data in Azure Blob Storage, followed by schema-driven ingestion into Snowflake at the raw layer. We had no clever transformations, no logic. Nothing would change unless something was genuinely broken. On the other hand, nobody ever complimented this ingestion model, which is how I knew I was doing it right, especially when you have entire teams of consultants coming from the outside and they are looking at your tech stack. No, you should do it the other way around. My main takeaway from this is that early standardization can drive operational speed. Boring pipelines are much easier to maintain, much easier to govern, and it's also very easy to answer, to explain why yesterday's load failed. However, you can only avoid governance actions for so long. Early access was admin and developer heavy, and it was so by design. We wanted to allow citizen developers and just other teams in the company to start doing their own practice with the data we had already ingested into Snowflake. So that model worked very well because it did grow our adoption process. However, the auditors showed up and they didn't really agree with it. So we had to make a decision about how we are going to address security more than this layer of admin and developer. It wasn't so because we became governance enthusiasts, but we wanted fewer meetings. So we looked at this in two ways. We started doing RBAC modeling with roles mapped to business domains, and we clarified access ownership. And that's a fancier way of saying that a developer in my team became the security admin on top of his day job, and he wasn't very happy about it. But then security conversations became way more structured because we had a model and we used the Snowflake lattice model and their tool to implement this RBAC model with. And we weren't reactive anymore when these conversations came up. A major finding from this process in our case was our relationship with the auditors. It turns out that they make for remarkable product managers. And if you treat them as such, instead of public enemy #1, you have a real chance of systemic improvement. They would come in with a fresh view and they would see things that we'd otherwise miss because we internalize them because we see them every day and we don't really think of it from that perspective. But they've proven to be a real partner, business partner into this, and we've bettered our platform thanks to our relationship with our auditors. And yes, we probably are the only team in IT that has a good relationship with auditors at this point. So my main takeaway from this is if you have an opportunity to implement governance, it works a lot better when you have clear risk or external pressure. And I would always use those moments to implement changes that would otherwise be resisted. So we talked about how we do our ingestion, we talked about the security, we talked about the tech stack, but we didn't say anything about how we're actually modeling our data. Early on, we knew we needed structure, but we didn't know how much of it, because we were doing this for the first time. We didn't have really a concrete business case other than we want data in a centralized location. So we knew we needed to design some semantic models, but the perfect semantic models early on felt risky. So instead, we approached it in layers. We took advantage of the medallion architecture in Snowflake. We did all the ingestion, if we think of SAP in our case. SAP has a database level, raw level, just German names, German table names, German column names. So we take all of that data out of SAP into this raw layer in Snowflake, and we wouldn't do anything at that layer anymore. Then we'd go one layer up, and we'd start, first of all, translating the columns from German to English. We added some representative descriptions to the columns that were used to the business and for the developers. We speak a few languages in my team, but German wasn't one of them. And we started joining, from a functional perspective, all these tables to give them a place to live. We started reflecting the functional modules out of SAP. So if you think of SAP as it operates on accounts receivable, accounts payable, general ledger, inventory, sales, and so on, we replicated those models under the form of schemas. So when we'd go one layer up, we'd have a schema just for accounts receivable, and that's where we would do the translation, the joining, and maybe a light filtering on volumes at that level. We would top everything up in the analytics layer, where we wanted to hold all of our business transformations, all of our business logic. So we worked with intermediary tables in order to achieve our calculations and for the model to be a bit lighter. We worked with a lot of stored procedures, and the end result for the data to be consumed in Power BI would be a view for each of these functional areas. We would work with tasks for automating the schedulings, for the calculations to be run in the back end, and so on. So what happened is that we ended up with a hybrid approach. We had some level of dimensional modeling star schema, but we had a lot of views that were purely business-oriented data sets. And that worked until we had all this adoption work as we wanted to, and we had multiple teams working on the same data sets. And that's when we took advantage and implemented a lot more structure under the form of Azure DevOps DBT. So when a team would try to make changes on the same data set that another team was working on prior to DBT, you can imagine that things were getting overwritten. That wasn't too fun. So that's when we introduced this layer, but it took us about 2 years to get there because we just didn't have so many teams coming from the outside, and it was still manageable for us. And we didn't have that traction on centralized data sets to say, this is a self-service, so this is the certified data asset that everybody's gonna use. So it worked. As a consequence, we did accumulate in those 2 years some technical debt. And I guess if you would ask me today if I would do it again, the answer would be yes, reluctantly, because I'm still addressing technical debt to this day. I have weekly sessions that I do that myself and my developers, but it was a good trade-off in terms of the speed and the adoption. Again, keeping in mind our internal team's size. So my main takeaway from this would be that layering, as you see it on this side, created some safety boundaries for us. It didn't block teams from working on this space, but it did allow data models to be contained. These safety boundaries then drove for other implementations. However, I would suggest that if you want to do very strict modeling on data, to root it in real-world usage, in actually answering the business questions that you get, rather than thinking, this should look like a star schema, this is a Snowflake schema, and this is how generally it works with SAP. It didn't work so well in our experience with so much customizations and so many people working on these data sets. But with adoption and multiple vendors coming along, costs increased. So inefficient queries and excessive volumes stopped being technical details, and they converted into budget discussions. So we had to make a decision in how we're going to address this. And as our fellow consultants like to call this, we addressed it via the low-hanging fruit. So we didn't start with anything really fancy in optimizing. We just started separating our warehouses by business domain, business role. So we had a warehouse for just SAP, and sometimes even more granular than that. Everything that was ingestion would then consolidate into this SAP warehouse. So that allowed us to identify which queries were actually inefficient. So we addressed it in a very rudimentary way in the beginning, in the sense of looking at how much volumetry we have, how much is it actually used, because by default we'd extract as much as we could so people could use it. So that was the second step of it, and we topped it everything with, no, I'm good. Am I still, okay. And we topped everything with a layer of adjusting the workload to the it was adjusting the warehouse size to the workload. So we looked at each of these warehouses, and we adjusted. It was a trial and error, because sometimes you can go with an extra small, and it is maybe cheaper when you do your first runs, but as volumes increase, as you extract more and more data, it actually becomes more expensive on the mid to long term, because it slows down, and then whatever you don't pay in credits per warehouse size, then you pay in length of time that the warehouse keeps up. Cost optimization before adoption, again, is like the governance. It's very abstract. Cost governance and optimization, after there's an invoice attached to it and someone else has seen it too, becomes way more interesting. So my main takeaway from this process would be that cost governance after adoption is way more efficient, but it's way more uncomfortable as well, because you have to manage service delivery without interrupting any business functions that was already relying on these data sets. So everything needs to happen in the back end, maybe in a certain time interval. We did work a lot with clones in Snowflake to replicate what we were doing in terms of optimizations. But it is the best way to do it if you want to have the best accuracy in how you actually rein your costs in. Another exercise I'm still doing personally on a quarterly basis is that I do a swipe over our costs, and Snowflake now has this really good feature about already identifying anomalies in costs and consumption in their interface. So I already know where to drill down in the query logs, at which level and what happened there. However, we can't really talk about costs without talking about process. Deployment started to cause instability. At some point during these 2 years, we had a lot of people working there. Things were breaking. So the support team that we onboarded, we had the help of a support team that was external, but they were doing level 1 and level 2 support. They were confused because they didn't know where to intervene. There was no documentation either. Everything was reactive and urgent, and it needed to be reverse engineered at every step. So we started focusing on what we could improve in terms of this process with the biggest pains we've had. You would think maybe that at this level of a company, you would have one data factory per environment. We didn't. We started then separating our data, creating data factories for development, for test, and for production, and we added the DevOps layer on top of it. Once we've done that, and DBT came along also as a logical suite to the Snowflake corresponding data. But once you've done this, then you need someone to handle production migrations and deployments. So again, we thought that this would be a function that only the internal team should have to actually guard these certified data sets into production. So it became a heavier load on our team. However, when you pair that, when you think of it as, what do you prefer, addressing technical debt forever or having this weekly schedule of things that are getting somewhat organized? So that prompted for a migration, a release schedule. In our case is weekly. We're doing it in rotation in our internal team. And so that prompted weekly code reviews as well with the developers we're working on. In terms of how we do our intake for work, before it used to be, you should call Ioana if you need anything out of Snowflake. She'll know what to do. She'll help you out. You can imagine how my schedule looked like. It was more of a call center operation at some point. So we addressed that by working with the ServiceNow team. We created a catalog task specific to Snowflake with the items we found relevant. Audit was also very happy about that. And we topped everything with documentation and knowledge transfer for everything that made its way to production. We'd allow a couple of weeks of internal monitoring, and then we'd transfer it to the external third-party support team. We had a lot of documentation in our SharePoint, but it was very unorganized, disorganized. We had a lot of things lying around of developers having made notes. So that's where Copilot helped us a lot, and we ramped up our documentation game exponentially thanks to Copilot, because we consolidated everything. We just added it on top of our SharePoint, and it generated pretty much everything we needed with just a few iterations. So as a consequence of us implementing all of these processes, incidents stabilized, and we regained our trust, because there were a lot of questions of, can they actually do this? If we can't ensure for data accuracy on a consistent basis. My main takeaway from this phase, from this process, would be that we didn't ever implement process just because we sounded mature or responsible, or because audit tells you that you should have this and that. We implemented it to solve a known pain. And my observation was that once you do that, the internal team is going to embrace said process, because their day-to-day work becomes a lot easier. And we've actually had internal metrics to do this. I would touch base with our developers on a weekly basis to see how the work intake was going, how many concurrent meetings they had, how much meeting time they had, because everybody was used to developing in this chaotic way and knowing that there would be an internal developer to support. And there were some frustrating instances when the internal development team became the support team for a third-party vendor, because they were running against a tight deadline. They were paid for a statement of work that they needed to deliver. So with lack of boundaries as such, you would have internal developers working for the consulting firm. And that caused a lot of frustration. So it really helped that they've seen the difference after adopting these processes in how their schedule looked like, really. But before I go to my closing, I wanted to reiterate the takeaways from all these 6 little stories we've seen, starting with what we've noticed with our ingestion processes, that we've discovered that even though we didn't have a lot of standardization early on, we started with speed and we adopted better governance later. I'm sorry. After that, when we looked at our ingestion process in terms of boring pipelines, I've attended conferences like many of you did maybe, and Snowflake conferences where there would be clients of Snowflake with all these convoluted data architectures and pipelines. We love those. It's just that with a team of 3 internally, there's no way you can support any of that and have it up and running. Then we walked through the auditor's role and how they were our partner in all of this platform build. We've seen how we've done our layering and our data modeling upon need versus designing the perfect semantic model up front. We've seen the result of cost and adoption when it grows, how much it generates cost, especially on SaaS solutions, because I've worked for probably more in my career on on-premise solutions than on cloud, and it's still a frustration of mine that we still cannot issue a correct estimate when we approach a new project of how much is it going to cost. And we ended talking about how we implemented process as a reaction to something that was not working versus something that was supposed to be there from the beginning, and all these audit boards and committees that we see a lot of teams start with. So in ending, I would say that the hardest part of our journey wasn't choosing architectures or tools. It was deciding when to add structure and when adding too much of it would make things worse. I noticed that good data teams fail not because they ignore governance, they fail because they try to impose it before the system has actually earned it. So if there's one thing I will leave you with today is this: good or great data platforms aren't built by choosing speed or discipline. They are built by knowing which one you need right now and being willing to change your mind later. And in my experience, that judgment matters more than any fancy diagram out there. So, thank you. I think we're ready for Q&A now. Sure, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you for this very, very insightful.
Thank you.
And I do agree with just your whole process and framework, especially when it comes to adapting to not only to new technology but new platforms and processes. One question I do have is about security.
Okay.
How do your team handle security, and what any security challenges that you face, and how do you overcome that?
Okay, so to retake your question, because I was in the back of the previous session and I didn't hear any of the question. The question was around security and how we address this, especially with our teams and business roles, right? So we had the opportunity to have hands-on lab with Snowflake pretty early on. That was within our first year of operations, and they introduced us to this lattice tool that they have. It's native to them. They just hand it out to you because it was the standard they were using then. But we didn't start with the tool. We started looking at what's the majority of data we have in Snowflake and started modeling for that, our security model. We have 95.1% today of SAP data. So it made the most sense to look at these business roles and center the security model around these business roles. So we created variations based at schema level of security roles with the combinations you can think of: read-only, read and write, and then full access. So we dedicate a role for a business analyst that would have, it's a business analyst role name, business analyst for AR. Or for accounts payable, and you end up with a couple hundred rows like this when you do it, if you think of each database. But we did their standardizations in naming, and they have plain English names, and it's very easy to retrieve them. So that's how we approached it. We handle it all through a security admin role. And we still add on for any new layer and any new data source. We replicate the same idea of let's treat it as a schema level, and then if we want to restrict data per region and so on, then at consumption layers, the Power BI team was dealing with that. But it's all still, don't hold me accountable to that it's going to be our forever model, because we're still evaluating even today as to how we want to do these centralized data assets. I didn't mention it early on, and I think it's worth noting. We operate on a model that's called legs, And my boss is here. I hope I'm allowed to talk about that. It's not proprietary information. It's called local accountability, global strength, which means that the decisions are not center-led. The business units have the opportunity to address how they want to implement things, and if they like what the center corporate people say, then they would do it, but it's not center dictated. So that's why we're still evaluating things, and we needed this flexibility to address things. Hope that answered. Yeah. Sure. Go ahead.
Who do you get audited by? Like, is it IATF or is it something outside of that? And how long into your data journey did it take for you to get audited?
So the question was how long till we were audited and who audited us. It's the internal auditing team. It took us about a year and a half to get on the radar because people started talking a lot about, oh, we're having all this data lake stuff. What data lake? So I may be too transparent for this answer, but that was how it went down, really. And they have their own data analysts in their audit business, really. And they know what to look for, and they actually ask about data modeling techniques. What's your model? Are you really respecting? Last time they were asking us about the DEMA methodology. So they are very thorough, and it lasts for a period of a few months that you go back and forth, and then they check for you. You have to put action items with names and dates.
So that was something internal that?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you.
Yep.
When it comes to the actual tools that you used for implementing, did you go through, like, how often would you say you go through tool changes for, if it sounds like you've been with Snowflake for a while, but were there like tool changes that happened, and can you just kind of talk through how that went for you?
Yeah. So the question is about how many tool changes did we go through and how often. When I joined the company, the tech stack had been decided that it's going to be surely ADF for extraction, and Snowflake for transforming and making the data available for consumption, followed by the Power BI front layer. But then that was very lean, and so when we started looking at what else do we need, we started evaluating companies, vendors, as to what would be our best fit. And our criteria was always which requires the least headcount, internal headcount, to manage, because we were looking at we are still missing a middle layer in data modeling per se, because we just didn't have the staff for that, and we preferred to do it as much as we could in dbt and in those layers in Snowflake. So we didn't change the tech stack in 4 years. What we did was adopt some other tools to help us in the process, like DevOps and dbt. And even those, came with some overhead consumption because of all those weekly releases I was talking about. We are very often pitched other tools, but until we have a different strategy in terms of how we operate internally versus how much we rely on third-party consultants, we didn't want to change much, and I do want to give props to my boss because he did protect that a lot in our journey. He really listened to us in how much time we were wasting in just maintaining the platform. I hope that answered. Yeah. Sure?
Yeah, I don't know, you touched on it, and maybe it's not the main topic, but did you also check the box for disaster recovery? And I also want to ask, how critical was your vendor support? You've been with Snowflake,
Yeah.
tiers, probably at their business critical level.
Yes, we are business critical.
Yeah. So how's that been in your journey?
So the question is about how we treated our disaster recovery strategy. which is we have the minimum it takes, and we rely on, we just envisioned another account in another region. We are on an East US region now, and we've gone through some iterations with Snowflake. We had a lot of support from them, but we are also very wary about costs. How much would we want to put into that other account, into that other region? And we decided to go just with our main artifacts and refresh those maybe on a weekly cadence. I don't remember exactly today how the DRC account is maintained, but I think we targeted a weekly schedule. And we've done just the core layers of our data for that DRC. We're still very early on with it. We are in business critical, so maybe over-relied on that. But that's about it. We're doing the minimum there.
Yeah, I got it. Thank you.
Yeah. Sure.
If you onboard a new data source or vendor system because things are working well, and there is potential or likelihood of some field conflicts in what you already have, maybe something is really a derivative of data that you already have or another version of data you already have. How do you create, or update your libraries or make choices about, is the new one the gold version? Is the old one the gold version? Do you keep them separate? How do you do that?
So the question is about how we do when we have conflicting data coming into our layers, right?
Right.
So we rely a lot on the business, and we have a few strong business partners that we work with for them to decide their data governance on it, which is the field and which is the actual data piece that you recognize in this case. So sometimes that confirmation never comes. So we work with versions. We version the data set accordingly to which this business unit recognizes versus the other, which is not ideal, but is the reality. Hope that answered. Okay, I have 5 minutes left. Are there any other questions? Okay, and thank you for your time. I hope you draw some insights of this. Thank you.